Okay, let's start this unit by discussing an introduction to carboxylic acid derivatives, and I want to give these sort of a formal definition. So carboxylic acid derivative you should view generally as being a carbonyl-containing functional group with one leaving group bound to the carbonyl carbon. And this leaving group here is restricted in that it cannot be a strong base. So it cannot be a hydride, or it cannot be a carbanion type leaving group. Those would be aldehydes and ketones, and we've already explored those in previous chapters. Carboxylic acid derivatives, of course, like aldehydes and ketones, do undergo reactions with nucleophiles. There's a very polar CO bond, and that polar CO bond lends a great deal of positive charge character, electrophilic character at the carbonyl carbon. And so nucleophiles are going to attack that position. And the reactions that these carboxylic acids undergo, those mechanisms are known as nucleophilic acyl substitution. Also sometimes called addition elimination. They are substitution reactions, but they are not concerted substitutions. So they are not SN2. That does not occur at sp2 hybridized centers.